The Battle of Montgisard was fought between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Ayyubid Muslims, under command of Saladin on the 25th of November 1177 at Montgisard in the Levant, between Ramla and Yibna. This sits in the period being between the Second and Third Crusades. The Franks, at this time, were led by the 16-year-old King Baldwin IV, who was seriously afflicted by leprosy and heavily bandaged. His Christian force was heavily outnumbered when compared to Saladin's troops in what became one of the most notable successful Crusader engagements of the Middle Ages, and one where the Knights Templars' fighting spirit, martial discipline, and gutsy heroism shone like the bright morning star. Saladin's army was quickly routed and pursued by the Franks for 12 miles. Saladin withdrew back to Cairo, reaching the city on the 8th of December with only a tenth of the army he fielded. The loss of life, experience, weapons, treasure, horses and mules represented a strategic military and reputational disaster for Saladin and the Saracens, shifting the balance of power in the Franks' favor up until Hattin. Some Muslim historians considered Saladin's defeat to be so severe that it was only redeemed by his victory 10 years later at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. Although Saladin defeated Baldwin IV in the Battle of Marj Ayyun in 1179, only to be defeated by Baldwin IV again at the Battle of Beaver Castle in 1182. The Battle of Montgisard, 1177. In 1177, King Baldwin IV and Philip of Alsace, who had recently arrived on pilgrimage, planned an alliance with the Byzantine Empire for a naval attack on Egypt. However, none of these grand plans came to fruition. Instead, Philip decided to join Raymond of Tripoli's expedition to attack the Saracen stronghold of Hama in northern Syria. A large Crusader army, the Knights Hospitaller, and many Templar knights followed him. This left the Kingdom of Jerusalem with very few troops to defend its various territories. Meanwhile, Saladin was planning his own campaign, mobilizing from Egypt, aiming to retake the Holy City by force, and set off on the 18th of November, 1177. When he was informed of the expedition north, leaving the Holy City unprotected, he wasted no time in mobilizing his forces by invading the kingdom with an army of some 30,000 men. Learning of Saladin's plans, Baldwin IV left Jerusalem with, according to William of Tyre, only 375 knights to attempt a defense at Ash. However, Baldwin was intercepted and pinned there by an advanced vanguard of troops sent by Saladin. With Baldwin successfully fixed, Saladin left part of his army to besiege Gaza and a smaller force redeployed to reinforce the vanguard at Ashkelon and marched northward with the rest. The true numbers are impossible to estimate, since the Christian sources refer only to knights and give no account of the number of infantry except that it is evident from the number of the dead and wounded that there must have been more men than the 375 knights. However, modern historians generally deem the number of Frankish troops to have been lower. 375 knights and 80 Templars led by the Grand Master Odo de Saint-Amand, 4 Lestan, 500 armored heavy cavalry, as well as between 2,500 to 4,000 infantry and archers, spearmen, swordsmen, axemen, crossbowmen, and turcopoles. It is also uncertain whether the so-called knights included mounted sergeants or squires, or whether they were true knights. On balance of probabilities and our understanding, it is likely these numbers also included mounted sergeants. One contemporary chronicler gave a strength of 7,000 for the Latin army, while another contemporary estimate of 20,000 was probably a textual corruption of 10,000. With a Frankish force being so small and physically deployed on open ground, could explain why Saladin did not remotely believe such a tiny force of Christians should be considered a threat. Confidently, he marched at his leisure on Jerusalem, allowing his army to fragment and disperse out across the countryside to pillage the kingdom's farmlands. Just as uncertain are the numbers of Saladin's forces. An 1181 review listed Saladin's Mamluk forces at 6,976 ghulams and 1,553 karagulams. However, there would have been additional soldiers available in Syria and elsewhere, while auxiliaries might have accompanied Mamluks. William of Tyre reported Saladin's strength as 26,000 light horse, while an anonymous chronicler estimated 12,000 Turkish and 9,000 Arab troops. Irrespective of the accuracy of the numbers, Saladin was able to deploy in the field an experienced, trained force that dwarfed Baldwin's Accompanying Baldwin, who was on horseback, not on a litter as some think and depicted in the Renaissance painting above, was Ramla and Yibna, Lord of Autry-Jourdain, who had just been released from captivity in Aleppo in 1176. Ramla was a fierce enemy of Saladin and was King Baldwin's second in command. However, due to Baldwin's condition, the Frankish forces were physically led by Ramla. Also with the army were Baldwin of Ibelin, his brother Balian, Reginald Grenier, and Jocelyn III of Edessa, with Odo de Centimon, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, came with 80 Templar knights who had forced their way out of the besieged city of Gaza. Saladin continued his march towards Jerusalem, thinking that Baldwin would not dare to follow him with so few men at his disposal. He attacked Ramla, Lida, and Arsef, and assessing that Baldwin was not a danger to his forces, he allowed his army to be spread out over a large area, pillaging and foraging. Saladin's overconfidence about the size of his own army seems to have been part of his undoing. However, unbeknown to Saladin, the forces he had left to subdue the king had been insufficient and were overcome, and now both Baldwin and the Templars, having come from Gaza, were marching to intercept him before he reached Jerusalem. Further, with his forces being widely dispersed, communication, command, and control were in effect non-existent. The Christians, led by the 16-year-old Baldwin, shadowed the Saracens, executing a tactical sweep north along the coast, then maneuvering southeast, catching Saladin by surprise at Montgisard near Ramla. The location is disputed, as Ramla was a large region that included the town under the same name. Malcolm Barber equates Montgisard with the Mound of Alafi. Saladin's chronicler Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani refers to the battle taking place by the Mount of Al-Safiya, potentially modern Tel Isafi, near the village of Menahem, not far from Ashkelon, and within the contemporary Ramla province. Al-Safiya means white, and, indeed, the Isafi hill is white, with the foundations of a Crusader castle recently found at the top, called Blanchegard. Ibn al-Athor, one of the Arab chroniclers, mentions that Saladin intended to lay siege to a Crusader castle in the area, but Saladin's baggage train had been apparently become mired, hindering its onward movement. The Egyptian chroniclers agree that the baggage had been delayed at a river crossing. Saladin was taken totally by surprise. His army was in disarray. Part of it had been held up by the mired baggage train, while another part of his force was widely dispersed into raiding parties across the countryside. Some men had to hurry to collect their weapons from the baggage train, anchoring his line on a nearby hill. Saladin's options were limited as his cavalry was spent by the long march from Egypt and subsequent looting. Saladin's army was now in a state of panic, but tried to regain some degree of coherence, rushing to reform and make battle lines to confront the Franks. What the Saracens also failed to realize was they had been carefully maneuvered onto swampy ground where superior numbers acted against them, the local knowledge of the ground being likely attributed to Lord Ibelin. As Baldwin's army looked upon Saladin's, the king summoned the Bishop of Bethlehem to ride forward and raise aloft a piece of the true cross. The emotional and inspirational impact of presenting the true cross just before battle cannot be underestimated. The king, whose teenage body was already ravaged by aggressive leprosy, was helped from his horse and dropped to his knees before the cross. He prayed to God for victory and rose to his feet to cheers from his men, who were moved and deeply inspired by what they had just witnessed. Forming for battle, Baldwin, Ramla's knights, and the Templars, even though numerically inferior, executed a full frontal heavy-armored cavalry charge at the center of Saladin's hurriedly formed battle lines, immediately inflicting heavy casualties. The impact was immediate and devastating, creating a wedge, breaking the enemy formation. Baldwin, as weakened as he was by his condition, fought right alongside his men, which, as it would for Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, had an inspiring effect on his army. The Franks, with the disciplined heart of the Templars, put the Ayyubids to rout. Driving them from the field, they slaughtered an important number of enemies, several of whom were Saladin's generals. Faced by the rout of his troops, Saladin found shelter in the heart of his elite guard, composed of 1,000 highly disciplined Mamelukes. The Frankish knights, with the Templars, regrouped to charge this last line of resistance. They broke down the Muslim lines and nearly reached Saladin, who narrowly avoided being killed during the clashes by escaping on a camel. The victory was so complete that the Crusaders succeeded in capturing Saladin's entire baggage train. The king, fighting with bandaged hands to cover his sores, was in the thick of the fighting, further inspiring his troops. Egyptian command was under Saladin's nephew, Taqi ad-Din apparently attacked the Franks while Saladin was reforming his Mamluk guard. Taqi's son, Ahmad, died in the early fighting. Saladin's men were quickly overwhelmed. Saladin, luckily, avoided capture by escaping, as Ralph de Decito claims, on a racing camel. By nightfall, those Egyptians who accompanied Saladin had reached Conotum Esternellarum near the mound of Tel El Hessi. This is about 25 miles from Ramla. Baldwin pursued Saladin until nightfall, and then retired to Ashkelon. Deluged by 10 days of heavy rains and suffering the loss of roughly 90% of his army, including his personal bodyguard of Mamluks, Saladin fled back to Egypt, harassed by Bedouins along the way. Only 1/10 of his army made it back to Egypt with him. Baldwin memorialized his victory by erecting a Benedictine monastery on the battlefield, dedicated to St. Catherine of Alexandria, whose feast day fell on the day of the battle. However, it was a difficult victory. Roher the Maolians, Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, reported that 1,100 men had been killed and 750 returned home wounded. Meanwhile, Raymond III of Tripoli and Bohemond III of Antioch joined Philip of Alsace in a separate expedition against Haram in Syria at the siege of Haram, which lasted into 1178. Saladin's defeat at Montgisard also prevented him from relieving his Syrian vassals.